Hello and welcome to Bristol Ideas and this special event in our Cities series. In our work in Festival of the Future City, we look at cities in the past and what they can teach us now. Today we're looking at Paris and in particular the extraordinary changes in the city under Napoleon III in the 19th century. I'm Andrew Kelly, Director of Festival of the Future City. I'm joined by Esther da Costa Meyer, Professor Emeritus of Art and Archaeology at Princeton University and visiting professor at Yale University. We're talking about her latest book, Dividing Paris, Urban Renewal and Social Inequality, 1852 to 1870. This is a detailed, wonderfully readable and beautifully produced book. It's out now from Princeton University Press. Esther, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I am deeply honored to be part of this. It's a pleasure.
Could we start by just talking about Paris before the Great Transformation? What was it like as a city and how big was it, for example?
That's a wonderful question. So just before the Second Empire, Paris had about 1 million inhabitants. It's going to almost double that during the course of the 20 years, and the surface will be twice that size when it incorporates all the surrounding villages. So Paris was before Haussmann was the center of a donut. The outer part will be incorporated later on. So it was a very different city, a city that was less cosmopolitan, a city that was already had a large impoverished population of workers, but it was a city that was still conditioned by the tight urban fabric of the past, and that will have to change.
So, tell us about Haussmann and Paris. Most of us who are interested in cities and Paris in particular will have read about him or heard about him, but just tell us about him a bit.
So this was a city that had always had great administrators, and the administrators often outlived different regimes because they were so good. They were almost all lawyers, as was Haussmann. So they had to not just bring about urban change, though not at the scale of the Second Empires, but they had to create the legal instruments that allowed those changes. So it was a city ruled by administrators who were largely lawyers, but under Haussmann, what's going to change is he's going to bring a large number of engineers, and he preferred engineers to architects, and they actually have survived better than the kind of architecture that they did. And it was the engineers that will help devise the extraordinary urban infrastructure in water, sewerage, parks, streets that he's going to put in place, although they were never distributed in an egalitarian fashion.
These are points we'll come back to during the discussion. I was particularly taken by the comments about engineers. In a city like Bristol, you can't avoid the influence, for example, of Isambard Kingdom Brunel and the great work that he did here. So we've always been pleased and proud to talk about engineers. And one of the important things about the book, I think, is you don't just talk about that one person, but you talk about many other people who were involved in the urban transformation, some named, many not named.
That is a very important thing. You put your finger on one of my goals. I wanted to increase the number of actors to whom this enormous transformation has been attributed. And by the way, Brunel and the British engineers had enormous impact on the engineers of Second Empire Paris. They were really followers in many ways. And we already mentioned Macadam, who actually helped transform the paving of Paris. So I wanted to bring the names of these engineers. A couple of them have written books. The two most famous the one who was in charge of water supply and sewerage, Baltard, and Alphand, who was the one in charge of all the parks and gardens. One of them credited all his collaborators, but not all, because there were hundreds. Baltard, the other one didn't credit anyone. So like Haussmann, he attributed much of the change to himself. But Haussmann, in his very self-serving memoirs, 3 volumes, the last of which was published posthumously, he does name a huge number of collaborators. So in that sense, I wanted to bring them to life, but we still don't know the names of who was responsible for all the parks, the gardens, and all this extraordinary infrastructure.
And you do point at one point in the book about the need for more research into these areas, and particularly about women in Paris as well at the time.
That is very important. When I said I wanted to broaden the number of actors, I wanted the story of the women, half the population, and of the workers, 3/4 of the population. But women, of course, are not a monolithic category. They were divided by class, by education, and the stories, that, especially in my field, architectural history, that have been written about Paris are based on documents. And the sources are largely written by middle and upper class men, also of the workers. And many of these are very sympathetic treatments of workers and of poverty. There was a great deal of interest and fear of poverty, and that sparked some of the interest, some compassionate books. But in fact, the poor and the women are spoken for. So I wanted to broaden the number of sources. So I couldn't depend just on the archive, because the silence of the archive is a major theme in historiography today. You've got to go beyond them. So photographs, you noticed, of course, my love of literature. And the literature, of course, the books I'm quoting, Proust, Balzac, Hugo, Baudelaire, they weren't writing about women, but it's in the novels that you find things that they're describing. The women creeping out at night, the poor women in the garden stripping bark from the trees, which was forbidden because they couldn't afford fuel. Or the daylight savings, the poor lived with daylight savings. The sun went down, there was no more light. They couldn't afford candles. And so the books taught me. They taught me the stigma of living on the 6th floor before elevators were introduced, the social stigma. So I learned as much from literature, if not more, than from reading architectural history or just history.
Now at the time, city planning, at the time, the word urbanism didn't exist, did it? It was anew, that came later. But the people that you talk about seemed to me anyway, passionately interested in city planning. They read widely. They wrote widely. You talk about Haussmann's, at one point he wrote almost a book on water, which was presented, I think, to the local administrators. How much material did they have to draw on, or did they have to create a lot of this themselves?
That's a crucial question, and I'm so glad you asked that. So, as you're absolutely right, the word urbanism or city planning as such did not exist either as a word or as a discipline. So, and there had never been what the French call a plan d'ensemble, a general plan for all the city. And Haussmann's predecessor, Rambuteau, the Count of Rambuteau, under the July monarchy, had been criticized for not having such a plan. Now, Haussmann didn't have one either. It seems now, in retrospect, at hindsight, as if he had planned everything from the start. He did not. It was done piecemeal, although he makes it seem as if he had. But what he did do, he created the first plan of Paris that took topography into account, because since he was going to drive these huge avenues through a very hilly terrain, he had to know what he was meeting. So he did that. But for urban planning as such, even though the practice existed, the idea or the word did not, he had to rely on a number of thinkers, economists, political scientists, that word didn't exist either, but politicians who had worked on specific aspects, and engineers. So Paris had great urban thinkers, but they came from different disciplines. And just before, or just after Haussmann was named as prefect, because Paris, France being a very centralized city, Paris didn't have a mayor until Jacques Chirac in the 70s. It was two powerful positions, so it had to be split with the prefect of the police and the prefect of the Seine, who was Haussmann. So the emperor, actually, who read widely on about France. He grew up in exile. France is a city, Paris a city he did not know. So he named a committee of 3 men, and they fanned out and created an extraordinary documentation. They approached economists, bankers, people who had written, administrators who had written on different aspects of the cities, and they compiled a huge documentation of 1,200 pages on sewers, on waters, not on everything, sorry, not sewers, sorry, water, on gardens, the need for public housing for workers, of transportation, cemeteries, markets. The blueprint for change was there. This does not take away Haussmann's importance as the person who was this thick, bull-headed, perpendicular Protestant who had this very strong iron-fisted personality. He rammed them through, but he was the one who was going to coordinate these plans. So Paris had great urban thinkers, but they thought piecemeal. And part of the planning, was prompted by the wealthy people or shopkeepers, bankers who wanted, who had been enriched by the fruits of the Industrial Revolution and needed the city to open up so that they could sell their wares.
I want to come back to that. Just one final question before we move on to that. The Napoleon III himself, you mentioned he had interests in Paris and in France, obviously, but what was his interest in the urban planning side of it?
Well, he had lived in Britain and would live in Britain again later on. So he had seen firsthand the great parks, Pennythorne's parks, for example, Paxton. He had seen all that and became interested. He also saw that London, like Paris, was split into a very wealthy West End and impoverished East End. And so he wanted to do something in his fear of revolution. He wanted to benefit the eastern part of Paris where the poor lived. So he was looking very, very closely. He always spoke French with a slight accent. He was partly German, and therefore he was a foreigner, so to speak, and overshadowed by his tiny little uncle, Napoleon Bonaparte, who cast this very large shadow over his reign. You
mentioned about one of the factors that motivated the change was this fear of revolution and the need to make sure that Paris could be protected against revolutionaries. That's often said to be one of the reasons for the major changes, but also making Paris modern, making it suitable for modern capitalism, people to sell their wares and so on. What were these motivating factors?
That's, I think, one of the central, you touch on one of the central issues. To a great extent, the overhaul of the city of Paris was prompted by fear. First of all, fear of revolution. They had a number of uprisings since 1789, 1830, 1832, 1848. Napoleon Bonaparte had come to power as a result. He was elected president after the 1848 revolution. Then he had a coup d'etat. So his predecessor, Louis-Philippe, the king, had also come to power as a result of 1832 revolution. So they feared revolution more than anything. And so that fear didn't come just from the emperor, didn't come from Haussmann, it came from the moneyed elites who stood to lose a lot. So I found document after document of entire number of bankers, shopkeepers who wrote, we need more security, we need to guard ourselves from this. So that fear of revolution was coming from all the moneyed elites, and it was there. They're the ones who maintained the emperor and Haussmann in power. But there was another major fear, and that was cholera. Mm. The cholera pandemic of 1832 had killed over 20,000 people in Paris alone, and largely in the impoverished parts of the center of Paris. And so the hygienists, the medical personnel had been clamoring since 32 for to transform the street, to widen the streets, to tear down the tenements which were seen as a foci of propagation of the pandemic. Cholera returned in 48 and 49, and it returned in 54, a year after Haussmann left office. And because the districts where cholera struck were those where there were the uprisings against the regime, the elites associated cholera and revolution. Cholera was seen as a Jacobin scourge. And so that fear was there. So fear of cholera, fear of revolution. But the third, you've already noticed it, was the need of the great industrialists, the bankers who had been enriched by the revolution. They wanted to make, as I say in the book, they wanted to make Paris safe for capitalism.
Yeah.
They wanted broad avenues where goods and people could circulate. And they were one of the big forces behind that. In part, some of the best buildings built in Paris were not built by the emperor or Haussmann. In fact, they were the poorest ones, were the ones built by the theaters, the banks, the department stores. They were the grandest, the most modern buildings, the ones that were advertising the power of patronage, and they were expressing their power through architecture. So architecture mediated the social realm with this private sector, which was very powerful.
Now this transformation was enormous, wasn't it? I mean, it was as you mentioned, from sewers right through to the great buildings, the wide avenues. Let's just talk about some of those. At one point, you talk about the city becoming a gigantic laboratory for experimentation under Haussmann. What was the scale of the transformation?
Well, scale is exactly what distinguished Paris from the other cities. So Hamburg, London, England, Scotland had extraordinary engineers. The French engineers actually went to Scotland to see what they were doing, and to England to see what they were doing, sewage, also to Hamburg. But scale was what is this was the largest project of urban renewal in all of Western Europe at the time. And so this made it impossible for Haussmann to make all the decisions. He had to rely on a range of professionals who were trained in the Grandes Écoles and the great Polytechnique, for example. And so that was extraordinarily important for them.
We talked today about the importance of collaboration in building cities, in any project really. And one point that kept coming through as I read the book, and you've talked about it already, was that collaboration, bringing together those many different disciplines, and the essential nature of that in getting the results that were achieved. But you also need good leaders for that. And how good were those leaders at promoting that collaboration?
Haussmann was an outsider. He had been in the trenches as a prefect in southern France for 20 years. In fact, he spent more years in the provinces than he did as prefect in Paris. So he knew the integrity. And when he arrived in Paris, he knew that the municipality, City Hall, was one of the most full of Byzantine factions. So he brought in men from the province, engineers from the provinces who were outside of this machinery, entrenched machinery that had taken power in the interstices of the municipality. And so he brought in some very, very great people who would show their mettle. Many of them were scholar engineers who were very well versed in antiquity, in hydrology, and it was the quality of their training and the École des Beaux-Arts, which was very important.
There's a wonderful quote talking about the engineers by César Daly, who talks about the engineer is the outstanding creator of public wealth, that wealth without which a highly civilized nation can neither cultivate the arts on a grand scale, nor devote itself to the high-minded enjoyment they provide. I thought that was a wonderful description of the engineer.
And that coming from one of the more famous architects, he didn't build, he was an editor. And it was the time of enormous, almost downright enmity. The fear and the envy of engineers was something extraordinary. They were the great miracle makers. And Eiffel, of course, who was already active at the time. And of course, the Suez Canal, which was, of course, one of the major engineering feats at that time. So the engineers, and Jules Verne, I mean, the great heroes were the engineers.
We talked earlier briefly about Brunel and his influence on French engineers. And of course, Brunel's father had actually come from France, where he'd been trained. There is another Bristol connection, isn't there, which is the Macadam Connection. Just tell us that story.
That is quite extraordinary. So and the paving of the streets in those days were paved with cobblestones, wood, but both of these were temporary. They had to be replaced at enormous cost, and the barricades were made with cobblestones. So one of the things that Haussmann realized, but not only Baudelaire realized, Hugo realized, Heine realized that cobblestones came to be associated with the poor and with revolution. So Macadam, am I pronouncing it correctly?
Yeah, that's how I've always pronounced it. So let's go with that.
Macadam introduced this new system of streets that were built by layers of asphalt, and the emperor loved that. He was a great horseman. The asphalt did not have the problems of slipping, the noise. Cobblestones were very noisy. The percussion of the wooden wheels of the traffic. Baudelaire called Paris streets la rue assourdissante, the deafening streets of Paris. And so when people were sick or outside of hospital, they would put hay outside to muffle the sound, to protect the people who were sick or dying. And so asphalt prevented all that and prevented revolution. And so I published a map of Paris, published by Alphonse after the fall of the Second Empire, but it shows the paving of the cities. And you see very clearly that in the Western rich half, no cobblestones whatsoever to prevent, as they thought, revolution. In fact, the paving of the streets did not prevent the largest urban uprising, which was the Commune of Paris.
And the Bristol connection there is Macadam did some of that work in Bristol itself when he was developing the basis of the asphalt layering. I want to come on now to some of the lessons that we can learn for contemporary cities, but using your work as a way into that. There's many lessons as I read your book. Some of the issues that were being addressed then are issues we still grapple with today in cities, and Paris particularly, but also cities like Bristol and cities elsewhere around the world. And I just wanted to talk about some of these and just go through them with you. One of them is about this idea of cities for all, and particularly making cities homes, places of work for working class people. I mean, you talk about the great irony in the book about the people who built Paris at this time actually didn't benefit in the end. They had to move out to outer lying areas. The ones who built it didn't gain from it in the end.
This is a question that has been bothering me before, during, and after I wrote my book. It is how Paris of the 19th century is linked to our cities today. And in fact, I began my book by asking, paradoxically, inverting that. In order to answer that, I realized I had inverted. How does the present help us understand 19th century Paris? How do the problems, social problems, economic problems, the growing social inequality, even environmental, how do they help us see what we missed in the past? And so the exclusion of the people who are building the vaunted infrastructure of 19th century Paris from the benefits of that infrastructure was one of the things that are still with us. The other thing that bothered me very much is the fact that when I was writing this book, of course, I had been very much imbued by post-colonial studies. And I think it was the work in India by Indian scholars that helped me see what had been left out here. And the Paris that I studied with in graduate school was a Paris seen through the brilliant eyes of Walter Benjamin. Yeah. People like Baudelaire, but there were people whose lives had been circumscribed by a Europe that they saw as European. Today's postmodern, post-colonial scholars, also postmodern, by the way, but made us see that you cannot study a city like Paris in purely Franco-centric terms. Paris was not capital of modernity. David Harvey was one of my great heroes, pointed out. It was not the capital of 19th century. As Benjamin had said, the world was too diverse even then to have one capital of modernity. And there's the great Indian historian Dipesh Chakrabarti pointed out this idea of modernity as being a European phenomenon is one of the ways in which Europe arrogates to itself its imperial project. So I wanted to show that the colonized peoples were part of, contributed greatly to what we know as the rich culture of 19th century Paris. The museums of Paris are full of works of art which were either looted outright or acquired through dubious means that wouldn't pass today's ethics in regard to provenance. But more important, but more visible even, is that the parks and gardens, which was one of the great successes of Haussmann. He created extraordinary urban parks, the greening of the avenues, green squares, they were covered. They were display places for the plants of the colonies. So in all the colonies, and the colonial empire of France doubled under the Second Empire, they created botanical gardens which produced plants, shrubs, and trees. This was extraordinarily expensive because for the climate of Paris, these tropical things had to be bedded in during winter and bedded out. But so the parks became a way to display the colonial empire with the white man at the apex and the colonized people. But in fact, the colonized people were producing not just the raw matter, but the know-how. And I thought that was important. And this comes back to what you were saying. You looked at the banlieue of Paris, the greater Paris, which is surrounding by these sad, teeming peripheries. All our cities, not just Paris, are surrounded by either unassimilated immigrants, as in the case of the US with the Hispanics, or in the case of France, people who were born there, but whose ancestors came from the colonies. And in part of the refugee crisis in Europe today, most of the people seeking asylum hail from former colonies. So there is a direct link there. One can't just blame Haussmann and for that. There are other reasons. We have created global peripheries in our day. And the need for cheap labor, we have not just outsourced operations and production elsewhere, but we have imported a different and cheaper kind of working class. So these are issues that are central and continue to bother me.
It's interesting. We're running currently a series on contemporary French cinema about Paris, actually, and this has some of those issues that you've talked about there are central to these films. You talk about a film like Les Miserables, which is out, and there's the film about Gagarin, the housing estate built outside of Paris. These bring to attention today some of the similar problems that were existing in the 19th century. And housing is one of those critical ones, not just for Paris, but also for most cities. In fact, a city like Bristol, where house prices are phenomenally high and rentals are going higher and higher. How we house people has always been a problem, but is particularly acute now. But you saw this, didn't you, in 19th century Paris with the development of the peripheral areas, the split in the city between the centre and periphery, and the difficulties in housing those working class people, and indeed some middle class people as well.
Because they were evicted from the centre by gentrification, and that's another problem that relates to our cities today. Gentrification without social sustainability. When you gentrify and the prices go up and the original inhabitants can no longer live there. So in Paris, because the majority of workers they had to be working in the center of Paris, they had to be near their place of labor. Otherwise, they would have to walk an hour or even more to the outskirts where they could afford housing. Public transportation, the horse-drawn omnibuses began circulating too late for workers, and they couldn't afford it anyhow. So they began to worm themselves into the interstices because Haussmann couldn't destroy every tenement. So the density in the center among the poor increased exponentially, but at the same time, there was an exodus forced, especially of large cities, to the exterior. So this is very close to what we are facing today. New York is a typical case. All the cleaning, all the work, all the restaurant work is done by people who live further and further away and have to wake up at ungodly hours. But to come back to another resemblance with 19th century Paris, I said I wanted to diversify the number of actors and the kind of actors that have been talked about in books of architectural history. The working class of Paris came to a certain extent from other countries. A large number of Hessians, of Belgians, of Russians. The Hessians Germany didn't exist until 1870-71. So they were very poor. There was also a small group, we don't know how big it was, of Creole Paris, people who came from the Caribbean. They were not workers, usually freedmen. So it was a much more diverse group. The working class was much more diverse than has been pointed out, except in labor history.
I was interested to read when you talked about housing that Napoleon himself had designed some working class housing.
He did indeed. He intervened several times and he found ways to raise money. And there is a working class cité. Cité means communal housing, a communal in the center. Not communal, how do you say, collective housing, yes. La Cité Napoleon, which is still there. Now it is largely low middle class, but it was actually a very fine, built just at the outskirts of the center. So he was deeply involved, but he went about it the wrong way. And one of the people who played an enormous role was Chadwick, the English reformer. And Chadwick publishes over and over again in France the British British thinkers on the working class housing. Henry Roberts were translated, the emperor had them translated, and Chadwick gives a very stark and negative review of Louis Napoleon's housing for the World's Fair. So he was very, he's called a spade and called the emperor out. But Napoleon III was undaunted and continued creating things. He built also this very authoritarian wash house for the ladies, and they just abandoned it and revolted against it, shall we say.
And there are many others which I'd like to talk about as well. But one is about things like the provision of basic services in cities, whether that's water, whether that's dealing with human waste and so on. I mean, you had the first public toilets, for example, appearing during this period, but only for men and not for women. Yes,
that was even the guidebooks of the early 20th century, they actually note the few places like the Champs-Élysées where you could find a bathroom for women. And this was in books written by English and American ladies, because otherwise you wouldn't find this information. So the gender at the public toilets were largely for men. You had to wait a very long time to see public conveniences for women.
But the provision of water services as well, for whether it's the sewage that is taken away or drinking water and so on. I mean, this was all part of the transformation, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And here we see the private-public partnerships, because Haussmann liked to create vast monopolies. They were in private hands, but he got to control them by setting the terms of the contracts. And so this is another issue that we have more and more of the works in our big cities are done by public-private partnerships, but they come with strings attached. And now these strings are largely imposed by the private sector, not the public sector. So, but I made a mistake earlier on. I was so enthusiastic. I mentioned Baltard. It wasn't Baltard, but Eugène Belgrand, who was the great scholar engineer who was responsible for finding water supply. He had to go far afield, like a modern shaman, to find sources of water that could come downhill to Paris by gravity alone, and had to reach Paris at a relatively low temperature. And he also the sewerage. He's the one who created the famous sewers of Paris. But he was also a great scholar in paleography and Roman archaeology. So he knew the past, and he quoted the classics in the original. He wrote several books, and he was, I think, the most brilliant of the scholar engineers of Haussmann. But England played an important, so did Germans to a lesser extent, but Haussmann and Belgrand sent many of the engineers, Haussmann also to England, to study what the British were doing in different cities. And they studied Bazalgette's work, and they studied they studied Paxton, the use of sewage farms, how they were producing these extraordinary urban farming, thanks to the use of human sewage. Haussmann is this Protestant who was absolutely fearful of any kind of germs, would not allow human waste in his sewers. So the sewers of Paris had no human waste, which continued to be collected in these foul-smelling places where they were sold as fertilizers or thrown into the river. So,
and when it comes to the private sector, it was the private sector generally that led the housing projects, wasn't it, for working class people?
Yes, because they were the ones who stood to gain by this. The Perret brothers were the bankers who bankrolled the most of the transformations, and they built themselves. They built all the beautiful. They were Sephardic, and they built the beautiful series of mansions around the Parc Monceau, one of the most beautiful parks. It's an 18th century park, but Haussmann unfortunately whittled it down and sold a third of it to the Perret brothers. This is where all the great Jewish families lived, the ones whose descendants were wiped out, the ones that Edmond de Waal has written about with such great feeling in The Hare with Amber Eyes, and most recently in The Letters to Commune. These are extraordinary books, and he has gotten it correctly, that that's where they lived. So this private, it's a double thing. They bankrolled this autocratic form of city planning. But the Second Empire was also unusual in that, unlike the last kings of France, and certainly the Bourbon, even more than Louis-Philippe, he had Jews and Protestants in his entourage, which is something that you didn't see before.
I mean, in one of the things we've been stressing for some time in this country is the importance of, big state role in building social housing for people. We simply don't build enough houses, and we've had governments in recent years of both left and right who've been reluctant to allow that market intervention. I think it's going to have to come at some point, because we are at stretching point when it comes to housing in this country. But again, learning these lessons from places like Paris is very important. There are huge benefits if the state provides housing for people, for work and for education and for continuity of tenure and so on. Let's move on. I was really taken by the section on the lighting of Paris. I've always been interested in street lighting in Paris, and here you had modernity moving from gas to electricity eventually, didn't you?
Yes, that was quite interesting. So the gaslight was considered absolutely shocking, it really began, it took hours for it to reach its full capacity. And so there was a lot of anger against it until electricity appeared. And early electricity was the glare was just too strong. And so Robert Louis Stevenson mentions the mild light of the gas lights. And the gas lights were also had a certain beauty for us who have much better sources of light. We can afford to be romantic about it, but because they had an army of lamplighters, and the great photographer Nadar points out that the lamplighters in his days were women. So they would climb light by light, so that the lights would be turned on over time. So you would see the lights beginning to flicker and getting stronger and stronger. So that temporality was built in. But the gas lights were lit on certain days of the year when there was no moonlight. When there was moonlight, they saved on gas. And as I quote one of the writers earlier, said a cloud would be enough to have a man robbed, because it would block the light. And then electricity came in, and light was linked, first of all, had always been linked to security. In the past, you had to be preceded, if you wanted to cross the city at night, by people who were armed with torches, and you had to have torches out as part of security. And so smashing lights in the past had been part of the first thing a revolution would do, is smash the gas lights. And as Victor Hugo points out, he said how you drown the city in darkness. That's the first thing, a revolution.
Yeah.
So that was there, but it then becomes linked to consumption.
Yeah.
Because right in the center of Paris, and I quoted several passages, consumption, the restaurants, the cafes, they needed light. So it was precisely the wealthiest parts of Paris who didn't have problems of security, they were already guarded, which had more light because of consumption, the need to consume the city at night. So this passage of light from security to consumption.
Mm.
And Haussmann managed to wrest lighting from his arch rival, the prefect of police. It is now part of the prefect of the Seine, that is part of the running of the city, not part of security.
And that brings me on to the two big questions really on this. The first is about the city of consumption. What are cities for? You know, are they there for bringing people together, where people can meet and work and live a good life? You know, or are we moving towards more cities which are designed much more for consumption? I mean, in a way, you need both of those factors, I think. But Paris, I thought, brought this into stark contrast in some of the things you were writing about in the book.
I was, that's very interesting, Andrew, because I was astounded at the number of times that the word consumption comes up in a range of different urban thinkers. They were not urban planners, but and you realize that, yes, consumption of goods, of restaurants, of cafes, the very gorgeous cafes of Paris. There were places for the wealthy, not the very wealthy, they didn't frequent, but the upper bourgeoisie, shall we say. But I also noticed that the word consumption meant the city itself became an object of consumption. The rise of tourism from Britain, the rise of tourism, catering to British. But some of the stores are still there, Smith and Sons. I mean, the city itself became an object of consumption. And this astounded me at how soon they realized that tourism was important and the city itself was lit up. And here we go back to lighting. One of the most extraordinary things was in the great anniversary of Napoleon Bonaparte. They found a spurious saint called Napoleon or something. And they began to honor that date, which was also the ascension of the Virgin, with these enormous displays of power. And in those days, all the great monuments were lit up in ways that showed, again, the city as they weren't consuming, but the city was the object of consumption.
Yes.
So spectacle, lighting is part of spectacle, which is very much the role of architecture. You mentioned the Grand Projet. Architecture itself becomes a form of spectacle, regardless of lighting.
And the other big question is about heritage and modernity, and about the issues where what do you save, what do you let go, what do you in fact destroy? And these are issues which we still grapple with in cities today. Bristol is grappling very strongly, much overdue, most of us would argue, because in terms of its relationship to the trade in enslaved people, for example. But what do you lose in a city in terms of buildings, monuments, structures, streets, and so on? And there was a kickback against this in Paris at this time, wasn't there? There was this feeling of loss. There was this feeling of cultural mourning, which we have today as well. Cultural mourning, exactly it. Absolutely. The protection of historical monuments was in its infancy at the time, and revolution has never been clement towards heritage. It was not just that they destroyed a great number of buildings, but the trees themselves were uprooted. So there was an ecological, the liberty trees, of course, were planted as a symbol of French, and they were knocked down. And so what to preserve and what to destroy, that was one of the biggest things that I hold, that in fact posterity holds against Haussmann, was the treatment of the working class expelled from the center de facto, and his treatment of heritage, his brutal treatment. If he had been more elastic, more flexible, he could have swerved his streets a bit and saved numerous works of art, but he destroyed palaces, he destroyed churches, and
he destroyed the churches and treat their doorways, their Gothic tracery, like salvage material. That then, oh, let's take this doorway and append it across the river, and they did. They destroyed it. They took the bits and stuck it in another Gothic church of another period. Fountains were particularly prone to relocation, so he relocates fountains that were built, and of course, in the new location, which was much larger, that they had to have a new plinth, they had to have more lions, they had so he transformed the heritage, and the heritage that was knocked down and the itineraries in which now became available, they were narratives. They were narratives which called attention to certain buildings that had to do with the monarchy or with a dynasty, with Napoleon, and so they were telling a story. They were part of a narrative, and so that is still with us. Haussmann destroyed entire streets. But can I just mention one thing, since you wisely bring out the parallel with the contemporaries? There is a wonderful hotel in Paris, an old Hôtel du Nord, and there was a film, a very famous French film with Arletty, called L'Hôtel du Nord, and a film that came out just after the end of World War II. And it was outside the Canal Saint-Martin, which was before its gentrifications, where the body was found floating in the French mystery films, you know, the detective stories. And so they decided to knock down this dingy building. And the public became incensed. This is the public of 20 years ago, said this is where the famous film by Marcel Carnet was filmed. In fact, the film had to be recreated in studio, but the film had such a power on the imagination, and the historic preservation said we see no problem in knocking this building. It had nothing to do with the film, and they preserved the facade because the impact of film, like literature, was important for historic preservation. And that's the problem with Paris. We know the Paris that was destroyed largely through Victor Hugo, through Eugène Haussmann, through the great writers of Paris, more than the historic Paris. And they have put a screen between our Paris. So our Paris is largely fictitious to a certain, our Paris before Haussmann is partly fictitious.
But one I wanted to mention was Nadar, the photographer, who, you know, used balloons, didn't he, to go up and take photographs of Paris during these great periods of change.
He was one of my most interesting sources. I quote him over and over again. He wrote this absolute searing, haunting book because he, on one hand, he took his balloon and he gazed down on Paris and could recognize nothing. So the first air photographs actually he added words. This is boulevard such and such, that is boulevard, because you couldn't recognize it. And we could, even today, it's hard to recognize what they were without the captions. But he also was the first photographer who went into the sewers to study them. So he writes an essay and he says, I am powerless, poor Parisian that I am, in seeing myself in a city that is no longer mine. I can't recognize anything. So the cultural mourning that was taking place was something. It wasn't everybody, because the poor remembered the city differently. They had a totally different memory. They had always been evicted. Home was something they lost over and over again. But the bourgeois, when their buildings were destroyed, Victor Fournel, or Victor Hugo goes back, I went back to the city of my childhood, and a street now goes over it. And the searing crying for La Cité Mère, the mother city of Victor Hugo.
I mean, one of the things we've been looking into is the idea of rootedness and the importance of rootedness in communities and in cities, and how the current housing crisis here, certainly, and I suspect everywhere else, means that people have to move fairly regularly, which means they can't become rooted, their families can't become rooted. And that was a similar problem that was happening in Paris of this period, with people having to move out. The other point I'd make in connection to what we've just been discussing is about the importance of landmarks and how people navigate around cities and tell people how to move around cities. You use the term legibility in the book a few times, and that's very important for us in making a city like Bristol legible and other cities legible. And the use of landmarks is very important in that, I find.
That is absolutely central. And the psychological safety of a child going back home to see the landmarks. Zola has a wonderful book, The Belly of Paris, about the great marketplace where Haussmann destroyed. I mean, this was even the plan predates Haussmann. Streets were destroyed to create these enormous markets, which were then destroyed later on to make way for a shopping center. And he has one of the characters, Florent, returns to Paris, where he was born, to the area where he was born. This area, and he looks up and he has no idea where he is. And all of a sudden he's astonished to see the church of Saint-Eustache. He has lost his bearings entirely. All the landmarks which provided his spatial identity were gone. And you feel the cultural mourning there too. Part of himself had gone as the city, like Nadar, crying for the Paris of the past. Yes.
So we get to 1870 and we have the Paris Commune. What happens then, and how long did and what happened to Haussmann after that?
Well, Haussmann survived, interestingly enough. He had been dismissed 6 months before Sedan, before the end of the empire. And he returns to power as a senator for, of all things, very Catholic Corsica. Why? Because he was a Bonapartist to the end. So he returns to power and he fights for historic preservation. The Commune destroyed the Tuileries, which were still standing, and probably parts of it could have been restored. As it was, they learned the lesson of Haussmann's symbolic geography very well. Let's do away with this hated symbol of the autocracy of the Second Empire, and so they destroy it. And again, they learned the lesson. The columns, parts of the statuary, they're all sold off as salvage and used for other buildings. And so Haussmann returns to Spar and to write his memoirs, which are very self-aggrandizing on one hand, but 3 volumes, he also gives us a lot of material, and he gives the name of hundreds of collaborators. Even though he attributes much to himself, he does point out, he does tell us who some of the collaborators were.
But his influence lasted a long time, didn't it? And he's still with us today. I think you think about Robert Moses in New York City, for example, Daniel Burnham in Chicago, Le Corbusier, what happened in Rio and Buenos Aires, and so on. You talk about some of these things in the book.
I actually, that bothers me a great deal because as a Brazilian, I am outraged because Pereira dos Passos, who was mayor of all-powerful Haussmannian mayor of Rio, studied in Paris in the heyday of Haussmann. And so he returned to Rio and he drove his avenues through these hilly terrains and destroyed the hills with the fine colonial churches, that is Baroque churches on top of them. Again, with the same inelastic, inflexible attitude of Haussmann. And of course, Robert Moses was a second Haussmann, same thing, just heritage, forget about it. Circulation is the name of the game.
And we've always been, I suppose, a bit inspired by Daniel Burnham and the Great Chicago Plan of 1909. Make no small plans. But you see the ambition of Haussmann in people like Burnham as well, I think.
Who quote him? Yes, absolutely, yes, definitely.
Yeah. And we mentioned him earlier, but when you think about what President Mitterrand wanted to do with the kind of Grand Projet program in the, when he was in power, I think there's similar ambitions there.
Yes, megalomaniac, but many of those, like the Grande Pyramide, the Opéra de la Bastille, the Grand Arche de la Défense, they were monuments. They were not for everybody. There wasn't like infrastructure that, however inegalitarian, did help a large part of the population, bringing water, sewerage, gaslight, parks. No, Mitterrand's were these highly concentrated in the center. And most of my book was written in the Très Grande Bibliothèque, in the big library, which is an absolute disaster. They were poorly planned out. They have survived badly in the architectural world. And many of them have had to be redone over and over again. Le Grand Arche de la Défense, the tiles falling off. It took years for them, over 7 years, I think, to rebuild part of the facade, and the problems in the Très Grande Bibliothèque as well. So, yes.
I mean, there's lots of lessons, I think, for contemporary urban planning from this period and from the ones who followed, who were influencing. Do you have any in particular that if you were giving advice on how to do urban planning today, what mistakes to avoid?
Well, it depends if you're talking about the European city or the American city. The American city, the automobile came to destroy a great deal. And we have the day city where people work and the night city. And in this country, people still are car dependent without any thought of the environment. Europe, I'm glad to say, the public transportation works much better. And so in Paris, certainly in the center, for example, you can't sell the entire building over to private sector. You have to have housing. So Jane Jacobs' great idea that you need mixed use in a city. You need to have people living together with commerce to make a city that's vibrant both at night and during the daytime. So these are lessons we have to learn. We have to use public-private partnerships in the way that privileges also the most vulnerable part of the population. We need more housing. And in this country, we need to stimulate public transportation.
It's interesting. We did an event recently with a writer called Richard Vine about a book he'd written about Birmingham, one of the major cities in the UK. And there they had a transport planner after the Second World War who reminded me very much of Haussmann and moving the city over to the grand, expressways and motorways of Birmingham itself. So I think there are lots of interesting lessons that we can draw on here. This is a rich book and one that anyone interested in cities and those building cities need to read. We recommend it highly. It's out now from Princeton University, the press. Our Festival of Future City is back in October 2023. Thank you, Esther, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I am delighted and deeply honored to have had this conversation. Thank you, Andrew.